Te whakarongo mai koe ki te reo irirangi o Aotearoa. This is Checkpoint on RNZ National. I'm Lisa Owen. Haere aki nei, see you in court. Legal action is brewing over the government's controversial MIQ booking system. Spain to the rescue. The goodwill of other countries stops New Zealand running short of COVID vaccines. 250,000 extra doses are due to arrive here tomorrow morning. Minister Kris Faafoi joins us live. The mission to vaccinate rough sleepers in Hastings. Countdown plans to trial body cameras for staff in the wake of increasing customer violence. Meanwhile, the store at the centre of the terror attack gets ready to reopen. And a ticket out of Northland's Level 2. Air New Zealand lays on another flight to help them avoid Auckland.
Ahi Mari, RNZ News at 5, ko Sarah Thompson tōku ingoa. The government is now confident New Zealanders can continue to be vaccinated at record levels after securing more than 250,000 doses of Pfizer from Spain. The Prime Minister confirmed the doses are en route from Madrid and due to arrive in Auckland tomorrow. Charlotte Cook reports.
The country was forced to look for new ways of securing COVID-19 vaccines when demand began to exceed existing supplies. Following news of the current outbreak, daily vaccination numbers peaked at almost 90,000 doses. Jacinda Ardern says she's now confident that with the new stock from Spain and the scheduled orders from Pfizer, the country will be able to continue record vaccination levels. She says officials are also working on a second, larger deal, which will be announced in a week.
And there are 13 new cases of COVID-19 in the community today, all in the Auckland region. The ACT Party is describing plans by the Green Party co-leader James Shaw to travel to Glasgow for a climate conference in November as breathtaking hypocrisy. The Green Party refused to attend Parliament at Alert Level 4, saying it would be a risk to public health. James Shaw, who is also the Minister for Climate Change, says it isn't possible to attend the United Nations Climate Change Conference virtually. ACT leader David Seymour says Mr Shaw should cancel his trip.
It's not good enough to say 1 week that we're somehow putting lives at risk by having a proper democratic parliament, but then say that his own agenda is so important it justifies flying halfway across the world, taking up an MIQ space, which is sorely needed the next day.
James Shaw says he intends to go ahead with his travel plans, but it may be impossible. The Qualifications Authority has made all students eligible for extra NCEA credits. It says teenagers who missed 16 days of classes because of alert level closures can get 1 extra NCEA credit for every 5 they achieve. The Linmore Countdown is likely to reopen tomorrow with increased security measures, a week after the terror attack which left 7 people injured. The West Auckland supermarket has been closed since Ahmed Samsudeen picked up a knife and stabbed several shoppers last Friday. Countdown's Kiri Hanifin says they have purchased body cameras for the staff to curb a surge in violence and verbal abuse. She says the incidents have been compounded by lockdown and the terrorist attack.
Had some terrible verbal abuse that's been related to that incident on Friday night, and I think it's just awful and it's hate speak. And I really would like those people prosecuted for what they've said to our people, and the fact that our team turn up the next day and go back to work after being spoken to so terribly just goes to show how strong they are.
Kiri Hanifin says the 26 staff on shift during the attack are still upset, and a couple are uncertain about returning. The family of a Whangarei woman say her murder is the worst chapter in their history. Bridget Simmons was struck by Samuel Hemuera Po more than 100 times in a beating in early 2019. Her buried body was found last year. This morning, her killer was sentenced to life imprisonment. He's not eligible for parole for 17 years and has already spent 3 decades of his life behind bars. Bridget Simmons' uncle, John Callan, says her murder was appalling.
Several of us have suffered loss of sleep. I find myself just stopping and bursting into tears. For some, it has affected the ability to work efficiently. For others, it's been a huge effort to fight off depression.
John Callan says Samuel Po has shown no remorse. The former politician Colin Craig has lost his 10-year legal battle against a press secretary he sexually harassed. Mr Craig has long argued that Rachel McGregor made false claims and defamed him. After failing to convince the High Court and Court of Appeal of an injustice, the Supreme Court has now dismissed Mr Craig's final legal avenue. Ending the saga, the court ordered the businessman to pay Ms McGregor $2,500 in costs. Moving now into sports news, the White Ferns have had an opportunity to prove the doubters wrong and avenge years of disappointment with a win in the T20 series decider against England in Taunton early tomorrow morning. The New Zealand women's side levelled the series at 1-1 on Sunday after a heavy loss in the series opener. Veteran White Fern Susie Bates says it's time the team shows they can match it with the top teams in the world.
All the pressures on England. I think some people had kind of not expected us to bounce back in that second game. So, yeah, just excited to be in the chance to win a series, which we haven't done for 10 years.
Meanwhile, Australia's cricket board has said it will scrap a planned test match against the Afghanistan men's team if the country's Taliban rulers do not allow women to play the sport. Despite being based in Australia for a third straight NRL season, the Warriors still hope to play half a dozen games in New Zealand. The Warriors will spend the 2022 season at Redcliffe near Brisbane, moving from their previous base on the New South Wales Central Coast. And finally, world number one Novak Djokovic's quest for a historic calendar Grand Slam remains on course after overcoming Italian Matteo Berrettini in 4 sets to advance to the US Tennis Open semi-finals. British teenager Emma Raducanu has continued her fairy tale run, reaching the final 4 with a straight sets win over Swiss 11th seed Belinda Bencic. She's the first qualifier in the tournament's history to reach the semis. And that's the news.
The school bells ring again, and don't forget your mask.
I have been asking them, hey, are you going to put a mask on today? They all said yes. There was a couple who said maybe. A bit of peer pressure is going to be applied there.
But Auckland students are still waiting.
Because of the fact they know that they don't physically have to go to school, they want to get into that, but, can we just sleep later? We do also put in, learning how to clean the house and learning how to do everyday things as well.
A class act. Morning Report, weekdays from 6 on RNZ National.
Te reo irirangi o Aotearoa, funded through New Zealand On Air. Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Rāmere Friday. Northland to Kapiti, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Cloudy periods and a few showers. Rain tomorrow evening or overnight, possibly thundery. Gale nor'westerlies about Taihape tomorrow. Gisborne and Hawke's Bay will see some high cloud. Wider upper Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough. A few cloudy areas. Rain from tomorrow afternoon. Gale nor'westerlies. Severe gale in some places from evening. For Canterbury and Otago, excluding Clutha, heavy rain about the headwaters with scattered rain spreading elsewhere tonight or in the morning, clearing later tomorrow with severe gale nor'westerlies easing. Bulla to Fiordland, also Southland and Clutha, rain or showers, heavy falls about western regions with possible thunderstorms, especially from tomorrow afternoon. Severe gale nor'westerlies in southern regions until tonight, snow lowering to 600 metres in the far south tomorrow night. And for the Chatham Islands, fine spells. That concludes the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Rāmere Friday. It's 7 minutes past 5.
Nā mihi Sarah, tēnā koutou katoa, no mai haere mai ki checkpoint e tēnei rā, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. See you in court. The government is staring down legal action over its controversial MIQ booking system. The test case was to be a pregnant woman with health complications who was denied an emergency allocation and managed isolation so she could get home to New Zealand for the birth. The matter was due in court this morning but will now be taken by another claimant after Bergen Graham was granted an emergency MIQ spot. The claim against the boss of MB and the Health Minister argues the MIQ system unreasonably breaches Kiwis' human rights, effectively preventing them from returning home. Among other things, it alleges there's insufficient MIQ spots available to New Zealand citizens, including those ring-fenced for emergencies. There's no mechanism to assess the merit of places being granted, for example, to foreign sports teams versus returning Kiwis. And the government has overstepped the law, pausing altogether the online booking system. Joining me now is Frances Joychild QC, who has worked on the case. Frances, to begin with, can you just give us an update? Bergen Graham, she wants to be the claimant. What has happened with her quest for a spot in MIQ?
Well, after a very busy week last week pulling the case together, I should say with tremendous pro bono assistance from lawyers all over the globe and in New Zealand, we filed judicial review proceedings in the High Court on Monday. And on Tuesday, we were advised that Bergen's applications had been reconsidered and she'd be offered an MIQ voucher. She got the voucher yesterday and we've filed a notice of discontinuance of the legal claim today.
Were you asked to discontinue when she was offered a voucher?
Well, yes, that was part of the settlement.
Okay, so she didn't make another application. They came to you after they knew you were going to court?
Yes, after we'd filed in court. Yes, which she'd already made 6 applications through the MIQ system and she had made 3 complaints. So 9 attempts to get supported, to get some common sense really on her claim. And we had no other choice in the end but to make this massive effort to get a claim into court, and it was resolved in 24 hours.
Right. It is your expectation that this case will be taken up by someone else. So I just want to look at the detail of the case that you had researched and presented. You say it's an unreasonable breach of the New Zealand Bill of Rights. How so?
Well, our claim, we had a number of claims, but one is that how the MIQ system itself is being operated at the moment is a breach of Section 18.2 of the Bill of Rights Act. And that says that New Zealand citizens have the right to enter New Zealand, effectively the right to come home. Now, the Bill of Rights Act allows you to intrude on that right, but only to the extent that there is no other option but to refuse entry, and the refusal has to be proportionate to what the government's trying to achieve. And basically, we believe the system is broken, and we argued that there's no prioritisation of New Zealand citizens over anyone else in the online system, and that won't be changing with the new portal arrangement. The vast majority of people who want to get to New Zealand, including its own citizens, have got to compete together for very limited spaces in the online system. So there is an offline system for New Zealand citizens in urgent need of returning, but in the government's own criteria, as I said, it says it's extremely high to reach that threshold.
And Frances, even if you meet the criteria, this is another point that you make, even if you meet the criteria outlined, there is no guarantee of a place.
Yes, that's absolutely right. So you can have the most dire personal need to get home, even for urgent medical treatment or whatever, and there is no guarantee you're going to be given an MIQ space. And, of course, currently the government's paused it, so there's no way any New Zealander can get into New Zealand at the moment through that mechanism. So basically there's massively inadequate space for New Zealand citizen urgent applications. And we also argued that there's no system of ranking applications according to merit. For example, at the same time the government was turning down New Zealanders with, hugely important needs to come back for compassionate or health reasons, it was handing out a large number of spaces in MIQ. And the time the 4 months Bergen kept trying to get a place, 70 foreign athletes and staff were approved to attend a mountain bike festival in Rotorua. 60 international competitors were approved to go to the Winter Games in the South Island. 800 Antarctic workers have been approved to go to Antarctic through New Zealand. And we've got a 22-strong British women's netball team. That's just a few. But we argued we've got New Zealand citizens who have a right to come back being pushed down for all these other situations. I mean, the argument wasn't against the Olympics or the Paralympics. We do, in times of hardship, the country needs a bit of morale boosting. But these are, just little sports events that are being given priority over terribly perilous situations that our own citizens are in overseas.
Frances, I know there have been some applicants who are, in essence, at the end of their visas offshore, right? So their visas are about to expire or have expired. Is the system creating overstayers? New Zealand offshore,
Well,
New Zealanders offshore who are overstayers?
Well, the New Zealand consulate itself in Los Angeles told Birkin there were hundreds of New Zealanders who our government had allowed for their visas to expire, and so they are illegally staying in the United States. And that's happening all around the world. New Zealand citizens are overstayers in many, many places at the moment. And in Birkin's case, I mean, after 9 different reviews by MIQ, they thought it was okay to keep her in Los Angeles, where she was going to be given birth as an overstayer, in a country where she had no access to affordable health care and she had a high-risk pregnancy. And she had no regular or permanent accommodation to stay in. And I have heard today of others in very perilous situations in Asia without food or water. There are huge mental health issues among New Zealanders abroad. They've been turned down for benefits to help support themselves and the reason they say, you're not in New Zealand. Well, they would like to be in New Zealand where they don't have to claim a benefit.
These are unusual times, Frances. There's a Delta outbreak at the moment, massive pressure on MIQ. The government would argue it is trying to keep the country safe. What are they supposed to do?
Well, as the research which the Grounded group did for us for the case we were taking last week, there's actually only 3 countries in the world that have put this big barrier on their citizens returning, and that's China, Australia and New Zealand. Other countries have put short-term pauses here and there, but we can do what every other country does and find a way not to treat our own citizens in this manner.
Given, Frances, that you had placed this matter before the court and it was due to, start that process, and all of a sudden your claimant is offered a place in MIQ, what conclusions do you draw from that? Well,
obviously the government doesn't want to litigate this, but unless it does something very dramatic to restructure its entire system to give proper recognition to its citizens overseas who want to return, it is going to have a lot more cases. I'm sure of it.
And do you believe that this case you have prepared will be taken by someone else?
Well, it's there for anyone who wants to take it. Grounded have done a great deal of help with it, so I think they're in contact with a lot of people in perilous situations. So, my advice to the government is to sort it quickly.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is Frances Joychild, QC, who worked on that legal case, which at the moment is in limbo after her client was offered a place in MIQ, she says, as long as the legal action was withdrawn. It is 16 minutes past 5 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Kia ora rawatu mo te whakarongo mai e haere ake nei, the push to vaccinate rough sleepers in Hastings. Green Party co-leader James Shaw is under fire for leading a delegation on a planned trip to Scotland for climate talks in November. The Greens staunchly opposed the House sitting during the lockdown, saying politicians should stay home and role model the health advice they expect the public to follow. Now, party co-leader James Shaw is in the hot seat himself. Our political reporter Annika Smith has more.
The Greens refused to return to Parliament under Alert Level 4, only letting Wellington MPs attend when restrictions eased under Level 3. Party leaders pointed the finger at Nationals' Judith Collins, accusing her of putting lives at risk for travelling from Auckland to Wellington for her opposition duties. Now it's emerged James Shaw intends to travel to Scotland in November. ACT's David Seymour says he can't keep up.
Last week we were putting lives at risk by coming to Parliament. This week James Shaw's going to fly into the second biggest COVID hotspot in Europe.
This year's United Nations Climate Change Conference is being held in Glasgow, and Mr Shaw, as Climate Change Minister, expects he'll be there. David Seymour says the hypocrisy is breathtaking.
I think if he believes that Parliament can be done by Zoom, he said teachers can do their job by Zoom, but somehow the 26th in a series of climate conferences is so urgent he's got to fly all the way over there, take up an MIQ space on the way back.
James Shaw has hit back at the accusations, saying there is nothing hypocritical in following health advice.
Well, unlike the National Party and the ACT Party, the Green Party believe that we should be following the health advice. So if I do go to Glasgow, then I will be following the health regulations on the way back in, isolating and testing, which is not something that Judith Collins did when she travelled from the heart of the current outbreak.
Mr Shaw says he'd prefer not to go to Glasgow, but unlike the resumption of Parliament last week, November's climate change conference does not have a virtual option.
It's not been made available to us. There are negotiations that are happening online, but the United Kingdom and the UNFCCC feel that we're not going to be able to make the kind of progress that we need to make without at least some portion of it happening in person.
If the Glasgow trip does go ahead, James Shaw will be the second minister to travel abroad since the borders were shut at the start of the pandemic. He'll go into MIQ on his return and says he's open to being part of the government's at-home isolation trial.
Ho mai o whakaaro. We'd love your feedback. Nō reira anei na kaupapa mo te hōtaka nei. James Shaw, is he a priority for MIQ? Should he be travelling at this time to Glasgow for a climate conference? And does MIQ need a total revamp? Pātui mai, text me 2101, tweet us at checkpoint.rnz, or you can flick us an email, checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. It is 5:20. Kia mau tonu mai. You're listening to Checkpoint on RNZ National. It's Spain to the rescue. The goodwill of other countries will mean New Zealand's vaccine stocks won't run short while we wait for the big promised deliveries from Pfizer next month. The Delta outbreak saw vaccination rates jumped from the planned 350,000 a week to more than 500,000, putting pressure on our stocks. A deal's been negotiated with Spain, and 250,000 Pfizer doses are en route and should arrive in New Zealand tomorrow morning. Here's Te Piremia Jacinda Ardern.
With this supply, we will be able to continue our rollout at significant or even record high levels. I want to thank the government of Spain and in particular President Pedro Sanchez. I'd also like to acknowledge the Spanish and European Union officials, the team at Pfizer and the team here in New Zealand who have all helped make it happen. They have been working around the clock, literally day and night.
There's 13 new Delta cases in the community today, down from 15 yesterday. All the new cases are in Auckland. The government's COVID spokesperson today is Minister Kris Faafoi, who joins me now. Kia ora, Minister. So, tell me, why did you leave it so late to get a contingency plan here for extra vaccinations?
I don't think it's leaving it late. I think it's making sure that we can meet demand. I think, as you said in your intro, I think partly as a result of the outbreak, New Zealanders sought to get vaccinated, and I think that increased close to 200%. So making sure that we can supplement the 1.8 million doses that we're getting from Pfizer with those from Spain. And as the Prime Minister said, I think you may have called it a deputy mayor, but as the Prime Minister said, we thank them for that. I think it's going to keep us at a rate of vaccination that is happening at the moment, and I think it's good to see that more New Zealanders want to get that done.
Well, the Prime Minister said that, negotiations had been going on around the clock in the last couple of weeks, when in fact in May of this year, the Auditor General's office told the government that it needed to get a contingency plan immediately in order to make sure that it had secure vaccination supplies if indeed there was a community outbreak of COVID-19. So did you ignore that advice?
No, we didn't ignore it. I think what you saw was exactly that happen, and to make sure that we are making sure that we are administering vaccines at the rate with which New Zealanders are demanding them. The additional 1.8 million that we're getting from Pfizer will be supplemented by those from Spain. And I think, as the Prime Minister said, we're also looking at making an announcement next week about more to, again, make sure that we're meeting the demand of New Zealanders wanting to make sure they get that jab.
Minister, is James Shaw and other MPs going to this climate change meeting in Glasgow? Are they a priority for MIQ?
Look, I think it is. I think I just heard the end of the sound bite from James Shaw. There is no alternative. I think it is important.
Well, there is, isn't there, Minister? The alternative is to stay home and say you're not going and allow someone else to take the MIQ spot.
Well, let me finish my answer. Important work of the government needs to continue. One of our other ministers went over to the UK to make sure we could get close to a free trade deal with the UK. There is no alternative in terms of an online or Zoom conference that many of us have been attending while overseas travel hasn't been able to happen. Making sure that the business of government still continues is important. It's a small number. I know that managed isolation spots are very hard to get hold of, but making sure that important work of government is also something we need to make sure is happening.
How big is the delegation, Minister?
Look, I don't know. You'd have to ask Mr. James Shaw about that.
Yeah, you just said it's small, so do you know that it is small?
Well, I wouldn't imagine it would be in the dozens. Usually when we travel overseas, it's usually yourself and an advisor, so it may be as small as 2.
But other MPs from other parties are booked on this trip as well?
And as I say, I don't know the exact number of people going as part of the delegation, but usually it's pretty tight.
Were they signed off as a group, or did they have to hit the refresh button like everybody else?
I'm not sure. It's not a request that came to me.
Do you see the irony in the fact that a climate change conference doesn't offer any online options?
Yes, but that's the hand that has been dealt in that instance. And as I say, I think making sure that the important work of government continues, as I've mentioned, is important too.
Okay, the freeze on MIQ vouchers, so other people can access them. When are you going to take that off and fire back up MIQ release?
But look, I think as Minister Hipkins may have told you yesterday, the resurgence of cases as part of the outbreak have put a massive strain on those managed isolation places, especially in Auckland. I think he said until we have a better idea of how long this will last, we're holding back those vouchers. As soon as we can open those up and free those up so people can get back into the country if they have a voucher, we will do that. But at the moment, it's pretty tight.
Yeah, so how long will that be? Because otherwise you're saying that there is an indefinite freeze on New Zealanders exercising their legal right to return home. So it becomes permanent at some point. So how long is the freeze?
So, again, as Minister Hipkins may have told you yesterday, we're constantly reviewing that. I think one of the good signs is...
When was the last time you discussed it specifically?
Well, that is an issue for him. But I as I've said, the number of cases is getting lower. That's a good indication that things are getting better. What we also have to be mindful of is that while we don't want it to happen, if there is an increase in cases, we have to be ready for that too, in order to make sure that people can isolate safely to restrict the outbreak if there were to be further cases in the community. That's a balancing act. As soon as we're able to free up some of those vouchers, we'll be able to. We will do that.
Okay, so you're on the Border Exceptions Ministerial Group, right? It's a group that signs off on group applications
Correct.
for MIQ. Have you okayed any group bookings since the Delta outbreak?
No, we haven't. Obviously, with the MIQ capacity being extremely constrained, loading up any more cases or any more bookings on an already overloaded system would not be the right thing to do. In fact, through negotiation and in some cases, some sectors being willing to free up their managed isolation spaces, we've been able to free up space from some of those group bookings in order to make sure that we can maintain a safe number of quarantine rooms to deal with the outbreak. The likes of the RSE sector and also I think some of the fishing vessels that have had group bookings have said that they don't need those bookings in the immediate term, and that has helped. But no, we haven't.
So how long is there a freeze on your group bookings then, Minister? How long's that frozen for?
Well, we keep assessing those on a relatively regular basis. I think what we do is we look at the forward forecast for about 6 months for what is expected in terms of New Zealanders coming in, what we might have been looking to in terms of temporary visa holders that can come in, and then on top of that, what we're looking at in terms of demand for groups. It's a bit of a game of Tetris, and we always like to make sure that we are not wasting space in there and making sure there are enough rooms for New Zealanders to come through in that, but also making sure that there are opportunities for likes of humanitarian, economic, or any other cases or groups to come in, then we do that. It's always a balancing act.
Okay, so in terms of that balancing act,
it's always very tight.
In terms of that balancing act, December, January, February, have you approved any bookings, for example, for the Black Caps, who, according to their website, are planning to go to Australia in January and returning in February? Have you approved a group booking for them?
I would have to go back and look at specifically what we have approved. I don't have that off the top of my head. Depending on the demand for MIQ spaces around the outbreak, as I say, we'd hope that demand will go down as a result of the cases going down. But I think, as Minister Hipkins says, we're constantly watching those settings and those numbers to make sure that those bookings that we have made already can hopefully be fulfilled. If things are getting tight, then that's when we have to start looking at those settings and making any different decisions.
Have you started to assess any of those bulk bookings for December, January and February that may already have approval to see if you can, retract it?
I haven't. That's more of an issue around the management of managed isolation capacity. So that would be Minister Hipkins. But I think, as he said, and I have said today, we're constantly looking at what we've already committed to and also the situation that we're in. If things get extremely tight, then we'll start having to look at what those commitments are and whether or not either they can be shifted or whether we can keep them.
So, Minister, can you commit, in the interests of transparency, to provide us with a list of all the bulk bookings that you have approved for December through to February, please?
Well, I can look at that. I'm not sure if they're already publicly available, but as I say, we look forward and look at the forecast, and we always try and maximise the number of New Zealanders coming home and maximising the amount of spaces that we can use for the likes of economic purposes as well.
Appreciate your time this evening. That is the government's COVID spokesperson today, and it is Minister Kris Faafoi. More than 500,000 children returned to classrooms today as schools outside of Auckland reopened. Students told RNZ they're happy to be back after 3 weeks of lockdown, learning in alert levels 3 and 4, though some admitted getting up in time for school was a bit of a shock to the system. Here's our education correspondent, John Gerritsen.
After 3 weeks of remote learning, the prospect of returning to Berempore School in Wellington today had 11-year-old Zach jumping for joy.
I was really happy. At home I was jumping around, really excited. It's much better at school than at home.
10-year-old Mira, on the other hand, said she was a bit reluctant about coming back.
I half wanted to and half didn't because I really liked sleeping in.
Yeah, what sort of sleep in were you getting?
10 o'clock.
That's pretty good. That's a good sleep in. Must have been a struggle this morning.
Yeah.
Once you got here though, was it worth it?
Yeah, definitely. I could socialise and see my friends again instead of seeing them on a tablet, iPad, computer, Zoom call.
Chloe, who's 10, says she too will miss the sleep-ins.
I've gotten used to sleeping in all the time, and now I have to get up at 7 o'clock to get to school, and I was like, I don't want to go.
Teacher Michelle McCracken says it's good to be in the classroom again, though it's not exactly normal under Alert Level 2.
It's a bit odd because you've got that extra layer of vigilance where you're like, oh, is there enough hand sanitizer and social distancing and those kinds of things. But it's always lovely to be back with the kids. You know, like the kids were saying, it's nice to be back together.
At Wellington College, the principal, Gregor Fountain, was welcoming the boys as they streamed into the school for their first day back at Alert Level 2.
Kia ora. How are you guys doing?
Good, thank you.
Are you all good?
Yeah.
Was it good to be back?
It's great
Honestly?
to be back. Yeah, it is.
How was the learning during lockdown? Did you get anything done?
Honestly, I think I was way more productive.
For the first time, the government has recommended students aged 12 and over wear face masks at school. Mr Fountain says the Education Ministry has made it clear that mask wearing is an individual decision and schools are not to pressure students or staff either way.
It's going to be a challenge to teach in a mask and to learn with a mask. So it'll be interesting to see where people sort of fall on that. And I don't have a sense, but Delta's different. There's significantly more people here wearing masks this morning than there would have been, during Alert Level 2 last year.
Most of the boys arriving this morning were not wearing masks, but most said they would put them on later if they had them.
Oh, I actually left it in my car, not gonna lie. I intended on wearing one, I just left it.
Well, you guys are going to wear masks today or not? You not bother?
Maybe.
Oh, maybe?
Yeah. Got a hair.
Morning. You guys going to wear masks today?
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. I'll wear it.
Later, I just have to finish.
Yeah, later.
Yeah, later.
I'll just put mine on now.
Schools now have 3.5 weeks to catch up on teaching before they break for the school holidays at the start of October. For Auckland students and parents, the wait to return to the classroom continues.
Kia ora E te iwi e haere ake nei e a checkpoint. Level 2 Northland wanting to buy passes past Auckland during lockdown can get a ticket to ride, or should we say fly, after Air New Zealand puts on an extra flight. Has Delta put the skids under plans for a phased reopening of the border? And we'll have more on the legal action brewing over MIQ. Homai o whakaro, we would love your feedback. Don't forget you can text us on 2101, tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ, or email checkpoint@rnz.co.nz. And it is time now for the headlines. Anea Sarah Mina Pitapita Kōrero.
Kia ora, Lisa. RNZ News headlines. Ko Sarah Thompson tōko ingoa. The government is facing legal action over its MIQ booking system, accused of breaching New Zealanders' human rights by effectively preventing them from returning home. The claim against the boss of the Ministry of Business, Innovation and Employment and the Health Minister says there are insufficient MIQ spots available to citizens, including those ring-fenced for emergencies. The matter was due in court this morning. However, the test case, a pregnant woman with health complications who was denied an emergency allocation in managed isolation, has since been given a spot. The case will now be taken by another claimant. The government is now confident New Zealanders can continue to be vaccinated at record levels after securing more than 250,000 doses of Pfizer from Spain. The Prime Minister confirmed the doses are en route from Madrid and due to arrive in Auckland tomorrow. Jacinda Ardern says officials are also working on a second larger deal, which will be announced in a week. Greens co-leader James Shaw is defending his plans to travel to Glasgow in November for climate talks. ACT is describing the co-leader's plans as hypocritical because the Greens refused to attend Parliament at Alert Level 4, saying it would be a risk to public health. Mr Shaw says he'd prefer not to travel overseas, but it is not possible to attend the United Nations conference virtually. The Qualifications Authority has made all students eligible for extra NCEA credits. It says teenagers who missed 16 days of classes because of alert level closures can get 1 extra NCEA credit for every 5 they achieve. And finally, Linmore Countdown is likely to reopen tomorrow with increased security measures, a week after the terror attack which left 7 people injured. Countdown's Kiri Hanifin say they have purchased body cameras for the staff to curb a surge in violence and verbal abuse towards said staff. Those are your headlines. Our next news and sport update is at 6.
Thanks, Sarah. No mai hoki mai. This is Checkpoint. Ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Ko taku hoa e nai anei. Ko Nona Peltier. She joins us live to talk about business news. Now, Nona, you've got a lot of fresh economic data that points to increasing price pressures as well a pickup in consumer spending. What have you got for us?
Yeah, it's a number of different pieces of information that tell a bit of a story. So for manufacturing, let's start with that. Sales volumes, which we're not talking about prices here, it's just the volume of sales, was in the worst showing it had in a year, and that was during the June quarter. So overall, that was still 19% down on a year ago. We're 19% up on a year ago, but in the June quarter, it was one of the worst showings we'd had for some time. Now, the sales, so that's dollar values, they were up 3%. And part of the reason for that was the surging price of energy. You won't believe it, but the prices, these are wholesale prices, rose 44% on the previous quarter. And so that's huge. And that's second only really to prices that we saw in the construction sector. Speaking of the construction sector, employment in that area grew 2%, an extra 3,700 jobs, and that was easily outpacing growth in all other sectors. So that's one piece of information, but we had others. For example, we have this bit of information. It's called the truckometer. People may not be familiar with it, but it basically shows real-time activity on the roads. Not surprising. Last month's activity was down because of the lockdowns right across the country. So the heavy traffic index, it was down 18% over July. Now, that's a measure of real-time current economic activity. So 18% down, you must say, oh my goodness, that sounds terrible. And the volume of light traffic, it was down 28%. That shows what happens, say, in 6 months hence. However, the chief economist, Sharon Zollner at the ANZ Bank, she's the architect of this particular measure of economic data, believe it or not. Very bright person. She says that it may not necessarily mean that the economy is as bad as those numbers would indicate. And she said that's because labor market data is really strong, as well as card spending. And she said that traffic levels, even though they're way down on the year before, they're not as bad as they were the first time we went through lockdown. And she said that's probably because, not only because people getting vaccinations and testing, driving to those clinics, but also because of an increased demand in activity by courier drivers. People are spending a lot more money.
Deliveries, yeah?
Yeah. And on top of that, and like I said, there's so much data today. The Bank of New Zealand's Seek New Zealand employment report shows job ads fell 12% last month, but they're still up by more than half on a year ago. So one of the reasons that is because a lot of companies have stopped basically advertising because they can't find any staff. So there's been a boom in casual working and so on. So lots of mixed data, but none of it really points to a slowdown in the economy. The economy, as far as Sharon Zollner says, is still overheated. And she's picking that the Reserve Bank is going to start raising interest rates from next month.
And Nona, shall we take a twirl around the markets?
Well, yes. So, look, the markets are looking kind of sick today. Australia, for example, was down well over 1%. That's their stock market. Ours was down 0.75%, 97-point drop to 13,096. And that's really because of a combination of concerns, mostly because, of course, the Delta variant, but also because there's worries about rising interest rates with inflation and so on. So the New Zealand dollar, it was narrowly mixed. It was 70.8 US cents. So that's a slight dip, but a bit stronger against the Aussie at 96.4 and steady against the pence at 51.5.
Thanks, Nona. Nona Peltier with Business News. Northlanders wanting to head beyond Auckland for a holiday have been given a ticket out of town thanks to a new Air New Zealand flight. The airlines announced a direct Kerikeri to Wellington route, which is the only way anyone can leave Te Tai Tokerau for non-essential reasons. Everyone driving must still prove their trip's purpose, but some iwi are concerned about the lax level 4 border monitoring. Anei te Kairi Poata, Anita Blake Person.
Traffic was running smoothly at Te Tai Tokerau's Te Hana checkpoint today. This car easily passing through for work further south in Whakatane.
Documentation that we needed and ID. Yep. Straight through, that's what happened. Yep.
Up until midday yesterday, nearly 43,000 vehicles had been stopped at Auckland's border checkpoints. Of those, 380 were turned back. To travel through Auckland's lockdown zone, people must prove their reason is essential. It can be work or personal, such as a wedding or a tangihana, maybe getting to an education facility. But here at the Te Hana checkpoint, Te Runanga o Ngāti Whātua's Chief Operating Officer, Anthony Thompson, has concerns about the way those movements are being monitored.
We've got the QR code, we've got the scan technology. We just need to make sure that it's being used. We're not seeing it on this checkpoint. Before today, the registration at one checkpoint to the next, was done by paper, but it can be done so much better by QR scan code.
He says it's vital people are being tracked so the virus doesn't make it to the north.
Who's to stop anyone from coming from the Waikato to Tai Tokerau, stopping halfway, picking up a couple of passengers at a gas station and then carrying on through? And that's why I think it's important to have the scan codes.
Police say so far they've been very pleased with people's behaviour at the checkpoints, and Superintendent Shannon Gray says they're trusting motorists to do the right thing as they move through Auckland.
And we ask that everybody plays by the rules in regards to that. So there are specific things that they're not allowed to do when travelling through Tamaki Makaurau, and that's making sure that they don't stop. And so we're trusting people to do that.
They're so trusting, in fact, that officers aren't monitoring the time that each vehicle takes to make it from one border checkpoint to the other.
It's quite a logistical operation to try and record times and manage the entry and exit of people over several up to a couple of 100 kilometres as they move through the southern borders and into the northern borders. But again, we put it in to the hands of the people who are travelling through to do the right thing and play by the rules.
At the moment, the only way out of Northland for a non-essential trip is by air. Today, Air New Zealand announced it's introducing a temporary daily service between Kirikiri and Wellington to keep Te Tai Tokoro connected to the rest of Aotearoa.
That basically provides every traveller that wants to travel from Northland around the country an option to do so. So if they're not eligible to travel and transit through Auckland on the Whangarei service, they do have the option of not doing that and still being able to move around the country on the direct service out of Kirikiri.
The airline's customer and sales officer, Leanne Geraghty, says it's a boost for Northland's tourism and they're expecting strong demand.
There are no requirements in terms of showing a reason for flying if you are going directly from an alert level 2 origin to an alert level 2 destination.
While it may be welcome for some travellers, Te Runanga o Ngāti Whātua's Anthony Thompson isn't convinced.
I'm a bit dubious myself. We're still in a national pandemic. And I think we should treat it as that. Yes, there are a lot of business operators in the Tai Tokoro that are struggling. A lot of tourism operators will be struggling as well. But if we don't go hard, go fast now, as the Prime Minister said, this could be a longer, drawn-out lockdown that we don't want.
The first flight out of Kirikiri will take off on Monday.
Right, let's get to some of the feedback flooding in on James Shaw's pending trip to Glasgow. Well, you're either on one end of the spectrum or the other. Some of you really don't agree with him going, others of you support it absolutely, and there's not much in between. So let's start. James Shaw is a hypocrite, this listener says. One law for Green MPs and another for everybody else. Climate change conference in a pandemic and no non-jet fuel options. Also ironic and hypocritical. Another listener says it is of the utmost importance that New Zealand's Minister of Climate Change attend this overseas conference, a crucial matter. It is very cute of Seymour to call the Minister out on taking up MIQ places when he said nothing about sports teams and other large parties taking up space. I totally disagree with Green Party member James Shaw travelling to Scotland for a meeting when New Zealand citizens can't even get an MIQ room. He is using the system for his own ends. Shaw fronting up to the climate change conference, it's imperative to sort climate change, an issue that will make COVID pale into insignificance if we do not sort it. Go James, says Tom. Someone else says, Earth to Mars, Mr. Shaw. New Zealand, or a third of it, is in lockdown. Rome is burning. Wake up and smell the coffee. Another politician's junket to Europe at this extraordinary period in New Zealand history. Appalling, says Jonathan from Auckland. Rosie, though, says, of course James Shaw must go to Glasgow to represent New Zealand. Just stupidity to compare this to running Parliament at level 4. And Anthony says, everyone is equal, but some are more equal than others. And this one from Diana and Nelson, who says, you can attend a national parliament by Zoom. You cannot make your mark at the most important international conference in recent times if you are not there. It is crucial that James Shaw goes. Yes, he should go, says Diana from Nelson. Keep it coming, 2101 on the text, or you can tweet us at Checkpoint RNZ. Locals are on a mission to get rough sleepers vaccinated against COVID-19 in Hastings. It's an initiative led by a local church to help the city's whānau pounamu, Anea Tom Kitchen.
This man's come off the streets and lives at the Top 10 holiday park in Hastings, one of the city's emergency accommodation hotspots. He joins the rough sleeping crew most mornings at Hastings Church, affiliated with the Assemblies of God, for a cup of coffee, some wheat bix and fruit. At first, he wasn't sure about getting a vaccination.
I was one of those ones that would get, let the natural immune system do it all.
But he says through kōrero, he became convinced.
I want to make sure that I am healthy and I can still live above ground instead of being one of the statistics.
And he'll be returning for his second dose in a few weeks.
Well, if it's going to save my life, why not?
This was an initiative dreamed up by the Hastings Church lead pastor Warren Heke. He says he got the idea during level 4 lockdown.
We set up to provide a connection point for the guys we knew would be on the street, and so we provided a breakfast and a coffee and an evening meal. And in the process discovered that all of our contacts were not vaccinated.
So we talked to the DHB and a vaccination crew arrived on Monday. He says some of the homeless people took a bit of convincing.
You're dealing with a whole raft of often quite wild fears, and also because there isn't much of an understanding or a lot of health literacy, you end up with theories that are kind of bits and pieces of other ideas.
He says how they're talked to is important.
You know, if we just said, here's the vaccines and you need to get it, we would have people who might respond, we would have others who would immediately resist because of the approach.
There's a way that he does it.
My approach is to be pretty self-effacing and just go, this is what's happened for me. This is why I'm doing something. And we've spent long enough to know, you know me well enough to know whether what I'm saying is made up or whether it's something I've actually experienced or something I know about.
He says it's about protecting not only the homeless, but the most vulnerable.
In that community we work with, we call them, the council started calling them whānau pounamu, and they're our most vulnerable, they're treasured family.
The DHB's senior cultural advisor, JB Hepere Smith, helped lead the clinic. He says things had to be run a bit differently.
You'll see the homeless turn up, you know, having kai and respecting that, and it's their tikanga, we're in their world and respecting that, and that's heartfelt, that's real.
Then it's a quick hui and meet and greet, the whanaungatanga, then it's down to business.
It's led by a karakia, and then once we've done the cultural lead and everything, and then we move into the into the clinical part.
Then in the observation, it's time for some kai and a laugh, and everyone's good to go. He says it's an honour to work with the whānau pounamu.
The reason why I say it's an honour because you're working for our people, you know.
The latest stats from today show nearly 97,000 people have had one dose of the Pfizer vaccine in Hawke's Bay, 66% of the population. 50,000, that's 34%, have had two.
It is 10 minutes to 6. I'm Lisa Owen and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. Hei muriaki ina pita pita kōrero. After the news at 6, too many visitors being allowed into Auckland Hospital during Alert Level 4. Countdown says the introduction of body cameras in its supermarkets will be a game changer in its bid to curb a surge in violence and verbal abuse towards staff. It says incidents of abuse against staff members have increased by more than 600%, primarily due to issues around mandatory masks for all customers. Corporate Affairs Manager Kiri Hannafin says the incidents have been compounded by lockdown and last Friday's terrorist attack, which left 7 customers injured at its Lynmore store. She told me the 26 staff on shift during the attack have been left upset and shaken, with a couple uncertain about returning.
So we're looking to open it probably sometime tomorrow, but that's something we're just going to work through with that store team to see how they go this afternoon, because it's their first time back in the store after the blessing. So to see how they feel and whether they feel like they can come back to work or whether they need a little bit more time off. But, you know, potentially it will open sometime tomorrow. But we're kind of going to do it very softly and just maybe it will be later in the day or maybe it won't be, but hopefully tomorrow.
Are there any staff who don't want to go back to the store?
I think there's a couple who aren't quite ready to come back, which is completely fine. And we found that in Dunedin as well. It took quite a few staff quite a long time to come back. And I think that's part of the process. Some people want to come back because it's normality and it's with their friends and their mates at work, and others definitely feel a little bit more apprehensive about it. And so either way, we're going to support.
And what does that support look like, Kiri?
So what we've done primarily is to offer really specific trauma counselling that we've got. We've got some great providers actually who are local Westies, and they've been working with the team. So we're doing that, and also sort of daily calls with all of the people who were in the store last week. There's 26 team on shift. So sort of daily check-ins and then professional support.
Are you going to do anything differently in terms of security? I know when we talked once before, you were exploring body cams. Has that progressed in any way?
Yeah, we are. Yep, we've actually brought them. We never got a chance to put them in place before COVID, so that's a bit of a shame. But yeah, absolutely. There's lots of things in the pipeline, but principally, the main issue. I mean, Friday aside, which I hope is just this inexplicable, terrible one-off thing. But, the aggression that we're seeing all the time is, it's really just about people's behaviour. And I can't kind of work out what else to do around that apart from asking people just to behave properly in our stores. But yes, body cameras, more security, more training, fantastic partnerships with the police. Everything that we can think of, and in specifically with that store, they already had a security guard at the store. All of our stores at the moment have guards, and we'll look to whether we need more guards in that store. I don't think that would have made a difference on Friday, but we're basically asking the team what they need, and we'll do what they ask.
So, is it your intention to trial body cams once we get through this COVID lockdown in Auckland?
Yeah, we're very much like to. We obviously need the union to support us on that, but we think it's the right thing, and we want to see if it works and want to see if our team like it. But we really want to capture. Particularly, I think I've said it to you before, the verbal abuse that we're getting. And in the last few days since Friday, actually, we've had some terrible verbal abuse that's been related to that incident on Friday night. And I think, that's just awful, and it's hate speak. And I really would like those people prosecuted for what they've said to our people. And I mean, I think the fact that it's been said and the fact that our team turn up the next day and go back to work after being spoken to so terribly just goes to show how strong they are and what courage they have. But I'm really keen on it personally. I think it'll be a game changer, especially in terms of that verbal abuse.
Kitty, what do you mean about abuse relating to the incident?
Okay, I'll give you an example. 2 nights ago, at the moment in Auckland, we've stopped the rest of the country because, we're actually doing it all over the country. We're managing the numbers in our stores so that we can maintain 2 metres between our customers. And so we had a young team member who was at the door with a security guard, and his job was to count people in and out of the store and do the greeting and say hello and make sure that people are wearing masks. And someone took exception to that, to him doing that, which is him doing his job and what we've been asked to do by the government. And they made a comment that, that it was no wonder people, stabbed our team. And I just think I can't quite describe how awful that is to hear. But, this guy came to work the next day, and it takes some kind of spirit, I reckon, to turn up the next day. But it also takes a pretty despicable kind of person to say something so pointed and hateful to our team. But I want that to be dealt with by the police. That needs to be dealt with because that's the stuff that hurts us the most.
And have you referred that to the police, Kitty?
Yes, I understand it got referred to the police. We refer all of our aggressive behaviours to the police, and and I have to say they're amazing at responding to it as well. We're very grateful for their care.
Kitty, in terms of the abuse that your staff are experiencing, I'm wondering if you are able to give us any more of an insight into whether it's because people are locked down at level 4 in the Auckland area. Is it any worse than it was last year, or can you see some other reason for it?
You know what? It is worse than it was last year, and I only just got that data yesterday. So last year, in April, we had a 600% increase in violence, and it's worse than that now in August. And so that shows you what we're putting up with, or what our team are putting up with. In terms of the reasons this month, it's around masks mostly, primarily around mask use, and it's our team are put in an almost impossible position of having to try to manage the public health order, which is mandating face coverings, and then manage the genuine exceptions and those who just don't believe in COVID or are anti-vaxxers or just have just poorly behaved. And if we get it wrong, we get in trouble, and by the customers, or we're just constantly battling, every issue. So it's not worse in Auckland. It's across the country, and at the moment it's really mostly to do with masks.
And has any of that turned physical?
Yes, we had a physical assault today. We've had store managers slapped in the weekend. Yeah, it's physical, absolutely.
So today's incident, can you tell us anything about that?
We had an incident in a South Auckland store where a team member was punched down the aisle. Yeah, it's physical and it's verbal. It's been a tough month.
And was that, Kitty, around mask wearing today?
No, I don't believe it was down the aisle. I actually don't know the details of the why. I just saw the report come through just before I got on the phone to you.
You must utterly despair at that.
Yeah, it makes me feel, very distressed and sick to my bones. Yeah.
Is the person okay?
It really hurts them. Yeah, they're okay. Yeah, they're okay. Well, are they? Who knows? They say they're okay. I imagine they're not. Yeah, no, I'm sure they're not, actually.
So, last time I think you increased wages for staff at a certain point. Is there any particular financial incentives at the moment for them working at various levels?
Yeah, that's right. So all of the team, during level 4, everybody in the country got paid 10% extra. So the Auckland stores are still getting paid their extra 10%. And we've also done things like, all of our team at the moment are getting 10% off their groceries and like little kind of treats like that.
And that is Countdown's Corporate Affairs Manager, Kiri Hannafin. To MIQ and whether it needs a revamp here. Again, split. Russell says about 18 months ago, Winston Peters told New Zealanders overseas to get back ASAP. If this person didn't get organised and get back when the borders were open, tough. Other people, though, say, why are we allowing New Zealanders to take European holidays during these last weeks and giving MIQ places to these people? How can this be prevented, says Rosie. Kim says MIQ needs an urgent revamp and those going to the Glasgow Climate Conference in November should not get priority. And another person says, don't forget the Wiggles granted permission on the same day as a man dying of a brain tumour was denied. And Kris says there's no ranking system and no wait list. How can this be after 18 months of trial and error?
Ahi Mari, RNZ News at 6, ko Sarah Thompson tōku ingoa. Countdown staff have had a surge in verbal abuse following the terror attack on Friday. The Linmore store in West Auckland has been closed for a week since Ahmed Samsudeen stabbed several shoppers. It's likely to reopen tomorrow with increased security measures. Countdown's Kiri Hannafin says 2 nights ago a staff member at the door of a supermarket was checking for masks and limiting the numbers of people entering the store when they were abused.
Someone took exception to him doing that, which is him doing his job and what we've been asked to do by the government. And they made a comment that, that it was no wonder people, stabbed our team. And I just think I can't quite describe how awful that is to hear.
Kiri Hannafin says the incident has been referred to the police, and she says the company has purchased body cameras for staff to curb a surge in violence and verbal abuse. The Green Party co-leader James Shaw is defending his plans to travel to Glasgow in November for climate talks. The ACT Party is describing the co-leader's plans as hypocritical because the Greens refuse to attend Parliament at Alert Level 4, saying it would be a risk to public health. David Seymour says if Mr Shaw was serious about public safety, he would cancel his trip. James Shaw says while his intention is to go, it may be impossible.
If I can't secure an MIQ spot and get back into the country, then I won't be leaving. If the situation of the virus changes and the health advice is that I shouldn't go, then that will be, I'll follow that.
James Shaw says he would prefer not to travel overseas, but it's not possible to attend the UN conference virtually. The Prime Minister has appealed to business and faith leaders to encourage their communities to get a Pfizer shot, saying high vaccination levels will help avoid gruelling lockdowns in future. The government has struck 2 deals with other countries to bring in additional vaccine doses to ensure the rollout can continue at pace. Jacinda Ardern says it is now up to New Zealanders to turn out.
In 2020, our COVID response led the world. In 2021, I want our vaccine rates too. We now have enough vaccines to vaccinate everyone in New Zealand who is eligible at pace. So now it's up to us.
Jacinda Ardern says everyone who gets a shot is potentially saving the life of someone who can't be vaccinated. Staff, patients and unions want a rethink of the visitor rules at Auckland hospitals during Alert Level 4. Auckland District Health Board has tightened its entry rules today, but is still letting in 2 visitors per patient, 1 at a time. The National Secretary of the Resident Doctors Association, Deborah Powell, says there shouldn't be any visitors at all except on compassionate grounds. She says the current rules put staff and patients at unnecessary risk.
ADHB is the only DHB that is allowing such visitor access to the hospital during a level 4 lockdown. Neither Waitemata nor counties are doing this. None of the DHBs elsewhere in the country had such a extensive visitor policy during lockdown.
The Director General of Health says the Ministry of Health has been working on updated guidance for hospital visitor policies. The minister responsible for internet security says there does not appear to be any link between cyber attacks on banks this week and a separate attack last week. ANZ Bank's website has been offline intermittently today, as were other organisations yesterday after denial of service attacks. Last Friday, an attack on an internet provider cut access for thousands of people. The Minister for the Digital Economy and Communications says the situation is complex but is not escalating. David Clark says there are no reports of people's information being at risk, but there is disruption to online services. The trial of the American biotech entrepreneur Elizabeth Holmes has begun in California. Prosecutors claim she lied about a blood testing device that made her a billionaire. She is accused of defrauding investors through false claims about a test that could supposedly detect blood conditions such as cancer. In their opening comments, Elizabeth Holmes' defence said she had simply made mistakes. The world's biggest plant to extract carbon dioxide from the air has opened in Iceland, a developing technology that could be scaled up to help tackle climate change. The plant is able to remove from the air the equivalent of emissions from nearly 800 cars. The BBC's Justin Rollout reports.
Taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere will be crucial if countries are to reach the increasingly widely adopted target of cutting emissions to net zero by the middle of the century. The plant works by sucking carbon dioxide directly from the air and depositing it underground, where it will slowly turn into rock. The whole thing is powered by renewable electricity, but at the moment the technology is expensive and small scale. The hope is that new plants like this one in Iceland will help prove so-called carbon capture and storage technology, helping drive down costs.
Moving now into sports news. Despite being based in Australia for a third straight NRL season, the Warriors still hope to play half a dozen games in New Zealand. The club's chief executive, Cameron George, has confirmed the side will spend the 2022 season at Redcliffe near Brisbane, moving from their previous base on the New South Wales Central Coast. George says while the preference was to return to Mount Smart, it was unrealistic due to the ongoing border volatility during the pandemic. The quest by tennis world number one Novak Djokovic for a historic calendar Grand Slam remains on course after overcoming Italian Matteo Berrettini in 4 sets to advance to the US Open semi-finals. British teenager Emma Raducanu has continued her fairy tale run, reaching the Final Four with a straight sets win over Swiss 11th seed Belinda Bencic. She's just the third woman ranked outside the top 100 to advance to the Final Four, emulating Kim Clijsters and Billie Jean King. But Raducanu says milestones mean little to her.
To compare yourself and your results against anyone is probably like the thief of happiness, and everyone is doing their own thing. I mean, I didn't compete for 18 months, but here I am, and it just shows that if you believe in yourself, then anything is possible.
And finally, the White Ferns have the chance to prove the doubters wrong and avenge years of disappointment with a win in their T20 cricket series decider against England in England early tomorrow morning. And that's the news.
Tonight on Nights, anthropologist Julie Spray argues it's time to factor the kids into our COVID-19 response. Our changing world tracks the expanding habitat of mangroves, literally on a collision course with many boaties. The games are finally over for our Japanese correspondent Motoko Kakubayashi, and our forest correspondent Dean Bagent Mercer is very excited about spring. On Nights with me, Brian Crump, from after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Te reo irirangi o Aotearoa, on air, online and on demand. Now the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Mere Friday. Northland to Kapiti, including Coromandel, Bay of Plenty and the Central High Country. Cloudy periods and a few showers. Rain tomorrow evening or overnight, possibly thundery. Gale nor'westerlies about Taihape tomorrow. For Gisborne and Hawke's Bay, some high cloud. For Wairirapa, Wellington, Nelson and Marlborough, a few cloudy areas. Rain from tomorrow afternoon. Gale nor'westerlies, severe gale in some places from evening. For Canterbury and Otago, excluding Clutha, heavy rain about the headwaters with scattered rain spreading elsewhere tonight or in the morning, clearing later tomorrow with severe gale nor'westerlies easing. For Bulla to Fiordland, also Southland and Clutha, rain or showers, heavy falls about the western regions with possible thunderstorms, especially from tomorrow afternoon. Severe gale nor'westerlies in southern regions until tonight. Snow lowering to 600 metres in the far south tomorrow night. And for the Chatham Islands, fine spells. That concludes the short forecast from Met Service to midnight Amere Friday. It's 8 minutes past 6.
Kia ora rā e ho, no mai, hoki mai. This is Checkpoint, ko Lisa Owen tēnei. Legal actions brewing over the government's MIQ booking system. The test case was to be a pregnant woman with health complications who was denied an emergency allocation and managed isolation, so she could get home in time for the birth. But the judicial review is likely to be taken over by other claimants after the woman was granted an emergency MIQ spot at the 11th hour. Grounded Kiwis has been urging the government to overhaul its managed isolation system. London-based lawyer and New Zealander Alexandra Burt is part of that group and she joins me now. Kia ora, Alexandra.
Kia ora, Lisa.
Are you guys going to take over this case?
That is the plan, and that's something that we're looking into at the moment. We are currently speaking with barristers in New Zealand and leading academics, and we have a strong group of volunteers who've already done a lot of background research on that. So this is definitely, obviously, we're so pleased for Bergen to have this amazing decision and be able to come back. But ultimately, the fact that it took her going to court to get that is something that's not acceptable. It shows how broken the system is, and it does need to change. So if it takes going to court to do that, that's where we need to go.
Have you identified your claimant or claimants?
We have a number of potential claimants at the moment. I say a number, I would estimate there could be hundreds of people who would fill the relevant profile. It wouldn't be grounded Kiwis who would be acting for any individual because we would need a barrister in New Zealand. We're in the stage at the moment of working out exactly how that would look and who that person might be.
What would you hope to achieve by going to court? What is the end goal here?
Ultimately, recognition that the system and the way that it's currently run breaches Section 18 of the New Zealand Bill of Rights Act, which, as I heard Francis discuss earlier on your show, ensures that every New Zealander has a right to enter New Zealand. And this is something that the government can limit, but any limitation must be proportionate and justified. And what we're seeing at the moment is the government skating on very, very thin ice with its managed isolation system. That's clearly evident by the fact that within 24 hours of Bergen's filing, the Crown took one look at her claim and thought, we need to give this woman a spot. We don't want this going to court, which indicates just how serious the issues are.
I know you have been talking to academics and other lawyers. What is your view on whether the current freeze on managed isolation vouchers is legal or not?
So what we've seen is a gradual erosion of rights, I would say, and the freeze that's currently in place is the latest in that gradual freeze. For some people, the fact there was a freeze didn't impact them at all because they were unable to obtain a voucher anyway. So it's just adding to what was already a very difficult situation. But what we're seeing now with that freeze is the only way you can get into New Zealand is by applying for an emergency allocation. And the criteria have been set at such a high threshold. And then the way that those criteria are applied and the evidentiary burdens that people need to meet mean that people who desperately need to get back are unable to do so. They don't meet the criteria, they're declined a spot, and then they don't have another option to use a system to try to get in. So they're literally stranded, and that is extremely concerning.
I'm wondering what kind of cases are you seeing refused generally? And to put it bluntly, is are cases where someone wants to come home and see a dying relative, are they meeting the benchmark at this point?
So what we're seeing is the terminally ill category. People have been able to meet that and have been able to get back. Obviously, you can't speak for everyone and there are particular individual circumstances, but that from a sort of evidentiary perspective, some people are able to obtain the evidence they need to be able to return in that situation.
Like a doctor's letter or a clinician's.
Exactly, a doctor's, Exactly, that's correct. There are other categories like the visa expiry category, where an element of that is that the individual needs to prove both that their visa is expiring and that they have tried to extend it and they've failed. But for a lot of countries, foreign countries that these people are in, they're just unable to obtain this evidence. If you take Bergen, she needed to try to get evidence when she was leaving El Salvador that she couldn't get her visa expired, renewed. And basically got laughed at. They said, you've got a stamp in your passport, that's all, you don't get anything else. And when you try to explain, no, but I need a letter, I need something to show my government, they just say no. And therefore you get denied because you don't meet the criteria. Or people that are in the US, for example, similarly, they would have to pay hundreds, I think it's $700 or $800 to apply for a visa. They know they're going to get declined on because they know they don't meet the criteria, just to prove that they've tried to extend it.
Alexandra,
Yeah,
I mean,
people in those situations.
Yeah, you would appreciate some of the commentary here in New Zealand. I just want to read you a couple of pieces of feedback that we've got. And it's a very polarising issue, right? So this is one of the arguments sent to us. People who made the choice to leave New Zealand while the pandemic was on should not be offered a place, is what one listener says. And another person says, Winston Peters told people 18 months ago to get back ASAP. And if you didn't do it then, well, and this is their words, tough. So, I mean, how do you respond to those people?
Those are comments we hear all the time. And in respect to the first comment, I would say that is a massive oversimplification of people's extremely complex personal circumstances. We have people that have been separated from their families for months, some even years, over a year now due to the pandemic. We have people that have shared custody arrangements. There are people that need to travel for medical treatment. People need to go overseas and return to New Zealand for all sorts of reasons. And it's not good enough to say, well, they shouldn't have left, because there are very compelling reasons why people need to travel. In respect of the second point, that's actually not correct, and that's a misconception that we hear all the time. That instruction was in relation to people that were currently, say, on holiday overseas and needed to return to New Zealand. But actually for those who are living abroad, the advice was shelter in place. It was stay where you are, stay where you have a home, accommodation, a job, and wait it out, basically, at the peak of that early stage of the pandemic. And if all those people had come rushing home to New Zealand, I mean, we know the state of the housing crisis that New Zealand is in. If 1 million New Zealanders abroad returned to New Zealand, I think the situation in that respect would be much more serious. So those people did what they were told to do. They sheltered in place. And then there have been situations that have arisen while they're over there. For example, ill family members back in New Zealand, emergency situations, loss of job. That's one we see really commonly. People who've lost their job, lost their house. They need to get back and they're stuck. They're stuck jobless, homeless, overseas, and they can't enter New Zealand.
Thank you for joining us this evening. That's London-based lawyer and Kiwi, Alexandra Burton. She's part of the group Grounded Kiwis, who planned to take this legal action in respect of the government's MIQ system. Opposition parties want to know if the Delta outbreak's going to have any effect on the phased reopening of the border planned to start from early next year. COVID Response Minister Kris Faafoi says Delta means some aspects will likely have to be reconsidered. Our political editor, Jane Patterson, has more.
Back in the first weeks of August, New Zealand was still enjoying the freedoms of Level 1, and ministers were starting to look beyond this year to the phased resumption of travel in 2022. That's based around a system that categorises arrivals depending on vaccination status and the risk profile of the country people had travelled from. That could range from free entry to 14 days in MIQ. Kris Faafoi told Parliament this week there's now new thinking, specifically specifically around whether trying to rank countries on risk is the best approach.
Recognising that all countries, all people coming into the country at this point have a degree of risk associated with them.
A second consideration is whether pre-departure testing at 3 days before travel is still fit for purpose.
That all plays into a question mark about what our medium to longer term border settings will be. We haven't set out any new thinking on that. Obviously, at the moment, the focus is on responding to the current outbreak. But I think we will have to look again at some of that thinking around particularly the country risk profiling.
National's Kris Bishop says the government's walking back a plan it released less than a month ago when the risks of Delta were well known.
3 weeks ago, we could stratify countries based on risk in light of Delta. 3 weeks later, apparently we can't. Nothing has really changed other than the fact we've had a Delta outbreak in New Zealand, but the government should really have been looking at those circumstances 3 weeks ago. So very strange backtrack, I suppose you'd say, from the government.
ACT leader David Seymour also asks why risk assessments for origin countries are only now being called into question.
Where was the strategic advice and planning and laying out of scenarios months ago when it became clear around the world that Delta was a problem, and the uncertainty it puts on New Zealanders to only be finding out the government might change its plan now just means that people are frustrated, they can't plan, they can't anticipate.
Jacinda Ardern says there's no change in position, just ongoing risk assessment.
That's all built into the framework already. It's just then what those individual country profiles look like in the way that we're risk assessing. And again, vaccine status is one of the most important factors within that.
And she says the timetable remains the same.
If anything, of course, we're seeing our vaccination program really speed up. And the quicker we can move through that, the more flexibility it does give.
Trials to see if having people who have been vaccinated could safely self-isolate at home is one possible option for next year, a plan to run from October through to December. And Ms Ardern says that work is progressing. But she says that pilot would ideally go ahead under alert level 2 or lower. And so alert levels in place around the country will be taken into account when it comes to finalising those timings.
It is 19 minutes past 6 and you're with Checkpoint on RNZ National. The number of visitors showing up at Auckland hospitals during Alert Level 4 is among the highest in the country, and staff and patients aren't happy. The DHB's visitor policy is under fire for putting vulnerable patients and a stretched workforce at risk. Katie Todd reports.
An appalling lack of social distancing, with visitors clustered together in queues and narrow corridors. 2 cancer patients have recounted their daily visits to Auckland Hospital during lockdown to RNZ, describing the lack of strict rules as distressing. Under Alert Level 4, hospitals around the country have only been letting visitors in on compassionate grounds, but Auckland hospitals are letting in 2 visitors per patient. The Resident Doctors Association's National Secretary Deborah Powell says up until today, the rules were even more relaxed.
It was basically an unrestricted policy, and today they have limited the number of visitors and how long they can be in the hospital with any patient. So we're still going to see visitors in the hospital, and the screening is still inadequate. There's no testing for COVID of people before they come into the hospital. There's no inquiry around vaccination status.
The Resident Doctors Association wants a rethink of the rules, ideally no visitors at all bar some exceptional circumstances. The Nurses Organisation agrees, and it's put its concerns in a letter to the Director-General of Health. It's also worried about poor visitor behaviour, including people refusing to wear masks and turning up in groups.
We are in a level 4 pandemic and we still have COVID spread in our community. So we cannot afford to have people unwittingly bringing COVID into the system.
That's Nursing and Professional Services Manager Kate Weston, who says vulnerable patients are at risk and also hard-working staff.
Our workforce is really stretched. We don't have the numbers to be able to unnecessarily stand staff down because they have been exposed.
In a statement, Auckland District Health Board's Director of Provider Services, Dr Mike Shepherd, said there'd been a full risk assessment for the visitor policy and the Health Board was comfortable any risks were being well managed. He noted that each visitor was screened for symptoms of COVID-19 and the 2 visitors per patient wouldn't be allowed to visit on the same day as each other. Director General of Health Ashley Bloomfield confirmed he'd got the letter from the nurses' organisation and said staff members have talked to the Health Board and confirmed its approach to visitors was consistent with the national policy. However, he said work is already underway to update the national guidelines around hospital visitors.
Our team is working with people from across the DHBs to review and revise the visitor policy in light of the Delta, as we're doing with a lot of our work, and that work's being concluded today, so there will be updated guidance.
Dr Deborah Powell is hoping changes happen quicker than last time.
To get this improvement, this slight improvement that ADHB has implemented as of today, the unions had to go so far as to issue a PIN notice, which is a health and safety notice, enforcing an employer to take due regard of the health and safety impacts this is having on workers.
Auckland District Health Board has declined RNZ's requests for an interview.
New South Wales has been shown the light at the end of the tunnel as authorities outlined the roadmap out of the pandemic. World Watch's Polina Lau has the details.
An exit strategy for the pandemic. The Monday after New South Wales hits 70% double-dose vaccinations, lockdown will be lifted.
We have more than 42.5% of our population fully vaccinated. We have some time to get to that magic 70% double vaccination when we can look forward to life being much freer than what it is today.
But State Premier Gladys Berejiklian says freer doesn't mean going back to pre-COVID norms. Retail, hospitality venues, salons, gyms and recreation spaces can reopen but with social distancing rules. Indoor entertainment facilities like cinemas, theatres and music halls will have social distancing and a capacity of 175 people, while large venues like sports stadiums and theme parks will have a cap of 5,000. Up to 5 adults can gather indoors in homes and up to 20 people outdoors. For weddings and funerals, up to 50 people can gather, but eating and drinking will have to be seated and no singing in churches. And if infections surge, there will be changes.
But at any point, if there's an outbreak or a surge, health at any time will give government advice to say people in a particular area, a particular town, may need to restrict their movements if they're vaccinated within their area, within their local government area, as opposed to going all over the state.
The Premier is being crystal clear these freedoms are only for the fully vaccinated.
What better way to mark Tongan Language Week than a mass vaccination event set up by the Tongan community for the Tongan community? We sent our reporter Marina Whangaiawa Muller to check it out.
The sun made sure to shine bright in the suburb of Favona for a long line of people in cars ready to be vaccinated, and all the nerves were left at home.
With everything that's going on, COVID, heaps of people passing away from COVID-19, it's better just to be safe.
This father says his 13-year-old son insisted they make a trip here because he wants to protect his much younger siblings from COVID-19.
Save the life for our family, then have a little brother and a little sister. It's not allowed to the ESO, yeah, just only him.
They pull up to the vaccination point and the teenager readies himself for his first jab.
Relax. Good. You're pretty big for a 13-year-old. You play rugby? Yeah? You just want to press on your arm for a second?
One dose down, easy as that, time to head home.
You're
okay. Your COVID-19 vaccination is done. Thank you for coming. Tens of thousands of Tongans call Auckland home, so when the city went into alert level 4 lockdown last month, a group of health workers, community leaders and church ministers drew up plans for today's mass vaccination event. Paki Lau o Aotearoa Manase Lua was one of those at the decision table.
We live in the hot zone. You know, the virus comes in through the Mangere airport. A lot of our communities, the majority live in Mangere. So all of us are, essential workers. We work on the front lines. So we're susceptible to it. And we also have, pre-existing conditions that, should we be sick with COVID, could be fatal.
Paki Lau and his colleague Melino Maka lead the Tongan COVID-19 response. They named the clinic Malu I Maatonga in homage to the popular rugby league team and ensured all vaccinators speak fluent Tongan. It's also Tongan Language Week, so nothing like a bit of patriotism to reel in the crowds, which Mr. Maka says he's thankful for.
The number of vehicles here today, there's a testament for that, and I just can't thank enough for our church leaders who actually we work alongside, and they right behind, and we since we started we're singing from the same hymn book.
While organisers hope to jab around 3,000 people during the three-day event, RNZ understands just 14% of the eligible Tongan population have received their second dose. As of today, 472 of the current community cases in Aotearoa are of Pasifika descent. They also make up a large proportion of the 31 patients currently in hospital.
We need information that's on video or voice recordings explaining the vaccination and the benefits of getting vaccinated. In the vacuum of that lack of information, there's a lot of misinformation that's flying around.
Malu I Maatonga is the first ethnic-specific event out of many more for those still in our harshest lockdown restrictions to take urgent measures in protecting themselves. This woman was the first to get vaccinated today. She says she prays and trusts the vaccine will keep her safe.
We pray and trust in our Lord that when we get our vaccine, nothing bad will happen to us. The vaccine is something that is going to help us and protect us from the pandemic currently happening in this world.
Melino Maka says there have long been calls for grassroots-led organisations to be given some control of the COVID response.
Our community, they got the full brunt of the lockdown. And quite often, sometimes, people in the high office don't seem to get the message, But I think that what we can demonstrate, if they want partnership, this is how partnership in the future should look like.
In 2 weeks' time, Mangawhaua Niue, the Niuean people, will hold their own mass vaccination event. Until then, Ha'oki Malu I Maatonga, the Toinga Papai Church drive-through for Team Tonga, closes on Saturday.
That's it from us. Ko te kaupapa tuatahi o Pōpō. Tomorrow on First Up, more from high-performance athletes calling for an overhaul of the MIQ system.
Kia ora tātou. RNZ News headlines at 6:30. Ko Sarah Thompson tōko ingoa. A pregnant woman with health complications who couldn't get into MIQ has abandoned a legal case after getting an emergency spot. But Checkpoint has been told other claimants are likely to seek a judicial review. Verbal abuse against Countdown staff surges following the supermarket terror attack. Staff, patients and unions want a rethink of the visitor rules at Auckland hospitals, and Greens co-leader James Shaw is defending his plans to travel to Glasgow in November for climate talks. Those are your headlines. Our next news update is at 7.
G'day, this week on Country Life, we're heading to the West Coast for the final of a rugby competition. That means more to some locals than the All Blacks.
The first game of rugby you'll probably ever watch in South Western will be a Woodham Shield side. My father never played, but my uncle did. It's just something that the people before you in South Western have all done, so all young men aspire to lift the shield for their town, and yeah, it's something that's just bred into us, really.
Country Life, Friday night after the news at 9, and Saturday morning after the news at 7 on RNZ National.
Kia ora Cosmo, and I'm Brian Crump, getting ready for another night on RNZ National. Got a busy first hour. My first guest, speaking of country living, is our forest correspondent, Dean Bagent-Mercer, joining us from Northland, and he is very excited about spring. He's going to talk to us about spring in the native bush, in our native bush, and the bush around him. And then Julie Spray. Now, we've had Julie on before. She's an anthropologist, specialises in child health. We spoke to her about free lunches at schools and a study she did a few years back into why people who might actually need a free lunch don't seek a free lunch. You might remember a bit of a kerfuffle about free lunches for some schools not getting eaten. Well, Julie had some very interesting things to say about that. Tonight she's going to talk about what she thinks might be missing from our national COVID-19 response, at least in terms of what we're factoring into it. And that is the kids. That's all coming your way after the news at 7. In this half hour, some items that have been getting a lot of hits on the website, starting with, speaking of country living, Dr. Tech the Dog Gadget has been on duty in Rakiura, Stewart Island, with her handler Sandy King. And then, well, there was an accident and he needed